Hello, I'm going to talk about rock and roll. And as you see, look what I've got on a Rolling Stone shirt. I'm going to talk about how rock and roll was an epidemic, okay? A global epidemic. It really was. I'm not just saying that. I'm not. No, it didn't hurt people. It wasn't a disease, but it plagued young audiences all over the entire planet for over a generation. From the 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, and earlier, all the way up to 20 years ago, or the 90s. Just think, it was the equivalent of today's version of TikTok. Yep. I'm going to go on and on, but I'll try to be short. It started out pre-Elvis, okay? You had Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, that came later. Louis Armstrong, big bands like Count Basie, and during Louis Armstrong's was Count Basie. You had Glenn Miller, you had, Glenn Miller, yeah, Woody Herman, you had Benny Goodman, during World War II. That was jazz, the swing era, okay? So I'm going to educate you about rock today. But then came Elvis, Hound Dog. The Beatles followed. They had long hair down to here. And people were crazy. It was like Taylor Swift today. The Beatles were the biggest thing. They had an impact in the world. You don't even know. Then came the Rolling Stones. I can't get no, as my shirt says, satisfaction. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you just might find you get what you need. They were the second band on the Ed Sullivan Show after the Beatles. I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, and all the other songs they performed live with those screaming girls in the background. So, rock and roll was an epidemic all over the world. You had the Guess Who, Roy Orbison, Eric Clapton, who sang Layla. You had Bonnie Raitt, Bruce Hornsby, Elton John, Your Song. Bernie Taupin wrote for Elton John. So, you had so much in the rock and roll craze epidemic. I'll be honest, without it wasn't a disease, it was sort of a pandemic. It was all over the world. You had concerts, you had Woodstock, Live Aid, you had Freddie Mercury, Brian May, you had Kool and the Gang, Earth, Wind and Fire. I'm going to name all of them that come to mind. I'm not going to tell you each one of them, but I'll say some. The Beach Boys, Bill Haley and his Comets. You had, who sang Rock Around the Clock, Bruce Springsteen. You had Rod Stewart. You had The Doors, Light My Fire, who sang I Wanna Love You. Jose Feliciano, Stevie Wonder, Ray Charles, Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston, Dionne Warwick, Aretha Franklin, The Contours, Benny King, Stand By Me. You had The Drifters, The Temptations. You had all these, Marvin Gaye. I heard it through the grapevine. Black artists. You had white artists. You had the Turtles from an English rock group. You had Queen, Freddie Mercury. You had, you had the Cars, Rick Ocasek, Rick Astley. Split Ends, I Got You from the 80s, the Talking Heads. You had, you also had hold on, let me think. You had Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin. You had all these big artists, even children's artists like Raffi and Joe Shrugs, and you also had Hap Palmer, as well as Norman Foote, a Canadian English children's composer, singer, songwriter from the 90s. You also had from here in Winston-Salem, REM. Winston-Salem, we had 2 or 3. We had Ben Folds. We have, all of this contributes to rock and roll. Van Morrison, Fats Domino. You had, everybody wanted to go out and buy Apple Records. James Taylor. You had, from here in North Carolina, James Taylor, Aerosmith. You had Bad Medicine by Bon Jovi, AC/DC, Black Sabbath, American Woman by The Who or the Guess Who. Yeah, all of this is rock and roll. Bonnie Raitt, I Can't Make You Love Me. I mean, as well as something to talk about, Layla by Eric Clapton. I said that, didn't I? That was about Paul McCartney's wife or ex-girlfriend or whatever, Layla Boyd or whatever. Yeah, that Eric Clapton was married to, Paul McCartney's. Yeah. You had Ringo Starr, Yellow Submarine, and Octopus's Garden. That means Octopus's Garden was a Beatles song Ringo Starr wrote. He's the drummer. You also had, you had James Brown, the King of Soul, the Queen of Soul, the King of, Aretha Franklin, she was the Queen of Soul, Steely Dan, the Doobie Brothers, Michael McDonald, Bobby McFerrin. Don't Worry, Be Happy was his only song that was published, but he also had Simple Pleasures and others, but his hit single was Bobby McFerrin's Don't Worry, Be Happy. Don't worry. Yeah, that was Bobby McFerrin. Bobby McFerrin is a vocalist. He's a human beatbox. He beats on his chest, and he sings. People all around the world went to Bobby McFerrin. He was a global icon in his day, from people in Germany, in places like that. They all went to see him on world stages, Bobby McFerrin. He had these vocals that were unique only to him. And I think he died, I heard, Gordon Lightfoot. He was rock and roll. The Grateful Dead, Fish, Dave Matthews Band. All of this is the rock and roll pandemic. It was an epidemic. You had people going to diners, jukeboxes, quote, were popular. They had these little coins that you put in, and they would play some of the hits, like from Happy Days, the Fonz. They just think of Happy Days, Fonzie, Henry Winkler. They would dance around in these skirts. People all over the world did this. They had to wear these things. So Roll Over Beethoven. Well, what that was about was of course, the Beatles song. That was all about Beethoven had gone down, and tell Beethoven the news, basically. He had classical before Rachmaninoff. You had Chopin, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, all of that, Vivaldi. They were like the big kahunas in their day, and all of them. So, yeah. And also you had Neil Young, Old Man, Look at My Life, I'm a Lot Like You. Well, that meant in those days that he was appealing to the younger generations of that time in rock and roll. You also had jazz, smooth jazz. Grover Washington Jr. and Kenny G followed. He played at President Bill Clinton's inauguration in 1992, the saxophone. And then which today has influence by them. As they say, Grover was the founder, the king of smooth jazz. As you have Gerald Albright, Earl Klugh, and Boney James. You have today Kenny G, still David Sanborn, Dave Koz, and then, which I don't know if he influenced Careless Whisper by George Michael, but that I think came earlier, yeah. And Baker Street, that was the other saxophone. That all came earlier. You had Bill Withers, who died. You had Joe Cocker, with a little help from my friends. Well, Joe Cocker was during Woodstock, the concert. He performed that in upstate New York. Woodstock was the hippie days. They did the peace sign. Yeah, those people wore long hair, and, Janis Joplin sang Paradise, put up a parking lot in that, as well as Jimi Hendrix, the Star-Spangled Banner, his rendition on his rock guitar, electric guitar. He died of drugs, Jimi Hendrix. You also had, during that concert, there were just hundreds of thousands of people that attended that concert. Hitchhikers hiked across the West Coast, from the West Coast to the East Coast, to Woodstock in the 70s. That was a huge thing. Farm Aid also came later. Bonnie Raitt performed that. Bruce Hornsby. You also had country stars. That was all a part of this generation. You also have I Can't Help Myself, Falling in Love by Bonnie Raitt. That was kind of recently. That was 90s, You had I Want My MTV in the 80s. Michael Jackson, Beat It, Smooth Criminal, Bad. Bad is still today one of the most popular albums. Michael Jackson, believe it or not, he was the king of pop. He still is, not Bruno Mars, but he still is forever. Just like Elvis is the king of rock and roll, and Faith Hill might be the queen of country. Michael Jackson had LaToya and Janet. They're still alive. Blanket, and Prince. He was almost as big as Michael Jackson. Purple Rain. REM. Let's get to them. They're from here in my hometown, Winston-Salem. REM, the lead singer, sings Everybody Hurts. Well, that was in the 80s. That really became a hit in the 80s, early 90s. REM is an alternative band. Other bands include Cracker, Lowry, and then David Lowery, right, and 7 Days and 7 Nights. That was the 90s. And then you had the Spin Doctors, Tracy Chapman, Give Me One Reason to Stay Here and I'll Turn Right Back Around. That was the 90s. That was, too. And you had George Benson, Al Jarreau, jazz artists like them, and Love Me Lady, Love Me One More Time, Turn Your Love Around. George Benson, that is his most famous song to this day. Turn Your Love Around, I Can Show You How. Turn Your Love Around. That was all about him falling in love with a woman. So, alright. So, I could go on. The Beach Boys, Surfing USA. You had Ray Charles. He was blind. So, he was from Georgia, Ray Charles. And he became blind. He wasn't blind at birth, but he became blind. And he started playing the piano at a very early age. He was a prodigy. People loved him. So, yeah, Stevie Wonder, he was blonde at birth. I don't know, but he played the piano. I Believe When I Fall in Love with You, It Will Be Forever, Ribbons in the Sky, Isn't She Lovely, all of those hits. So rock and roll, put it this way, rock and roll starts at Ed Sullivan and it ends about during the millennium, like Eiffel 65 and Christina Aguilera, the Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, Britney Spears, all of that. That was the end of rock and roll. It was still rock and roll, but it had come to a close. So I could educate you more. The Vietnam War was happening during the Beatles. So it was a time when crisis happened, and people needed music to lift their soul, So the Beatles, they all looked up to all the Beatles. So James Taylor signed with the Beatles. He signed with Apple Records. And so you also had New Age artists like Yanni, Enya, Only Time. Yanni had Enchantment and other New Age musical compositions that he wrote. You also had other artists like Neil Diamond, Cracklin' Rosie, Sweet Caroline, Henry Mancini, The Elephant Walk. That was all a part of rock and roll too. You also had Lawrence Welk. So Lawrence Welk was a stage show on TV in which they all got up on stage and performed, and you'd have a conductor and they'd have bubbles. So that was still on TV. You had Bobby and Sissy, so they would dance. You also had Herb Alpert, the T-Berry Shuffle, and Spanish Flea. And you also had in rock and roll, in addition to all of this, you have Alvin and the Chipmunks, okay, which was a cartoon in which it was three chipmunks, Alvin, Simon, and Theodore, and their master Dave Seville, would sing songs. They would perform on stage and give concerts and sing hit songs. So that was all a part of rock and roll. And Madonna. That was the Madonna, Cyndi Lauper, you had Rick Astley, Dan Hartman, I Can Dream About You from Streets of Fire. That was all a part of what's called, and even the Cars, Rick Ocasek. That was part of the New Wave, which came about 35 years ago, 36 years ago, 37 years ago. That was the 80s, 1980s, 1987 maybe, 86, 85. That was 84. That was after the 70s. Ronald Reagan was the president. So you had lots more to talk about rock and roll. The age of Aquarius. So kids would go out and smoke, talk about Earth, Wind, and Fire. There were hippies, so they would go out and protest, like Kent State. And then that was also Kool and the Gang, the Commodores, Patti LaBelle. You had Earth, Wind, and Fire. You had funk music. You also had disco, John Travolta, Casey and the Sunshine Band. Like Shake Your Booty, and also Keep It Comin' Love. That was during the 70s, late 70s, I guess, yeah. And that was during the psychedelic punk days, psychedelic disco, funk, So yeah, that's my lecture on music. But before that, you also had popular songs early, like you had crooning, you had beach music, like Charleston Charlie. This was all part of the rock and roll epidemic too. You also had the boop boop ba doo, and you had other things. You had doo wop music later that was like Get a Job, and you also had doo wop music bands like black music like The Moon Glows, Blue Moon, I Saw You Standing Alone, and the Penguins, Earth Angel, Will You Be Mine, and all this other stuff. And, you know, also you had Robert Plant, you had Simply Irresistible by Robert Palmer. That was another thing you had. You also had all kinds of Steely Dan. So Steely Dan had Reelin' in the Years, which was about a girl in the 70s who was reeling in her teens. So that was written by the great, wonderful Walter Becker, the late Walter Becker, who was one of arguably the best musicians at that time. I'm not, still to this day, arguably, he is one of the most harmonious musicians in the whole entire world in rock and roll. One of the greatest rock and roll musicians ever was Walter Becker. He was phenomenal. He wrote exceptional songs that nobody else could do. I mean, he was amazing. He was even just unbelievably unreal. Even Donald Fagen would tell you that Walter Becker had something about him that nobody else could come close. He was phenomenal. He was a gift, an amazing gift. But he wrote Do It Again, you know, Josie, FM, Hey 19, he wrote. All of this was written by Walter Becker. Black Friday, Bad Sneakers, Babylon Sisters, Hey 19, Third World Man, Deacon Blues, about Wake Forest from here, by the way, and Alabama football. Deacon Blues, you had, you also had as well other things like you had Only a Fool Would Say That, Change of a Guard, Bodhisattva, you know, Showbiz Kids. All of that was written by Walter Becker. One of his most popular albums had a song called Midnight Cruiser on it. That was Can't Buy a Thrill, which was one of Steely Dan's first. Michael McDonald sang with Peg. Peg, It Will Come Back to You. That was, I've seen your picture, your name and lots above it. This is your big debut. Come up with something new. So won't you smile for the camera? I know they're going to love you, Peg. I like your picture. I'd keep it with your letter. Gone up in Blueprint Blue. It sure looks good on you. So won't you smile for the camera? I know I'd love you better. Peg, It Will Come Back to You. Peg. That's about a girl in Hollywood who was famous, getting famous, and she was an actress. She wanted to become an actress in California. Her name was Peg, and Steely Dan wrote the song about her, backed up with accompaniment by Michael McDonald. So, from the Doobie Brothers. You also had Chicago, Color My World, the Bee Gees, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, which was later sung by Al Green. Al Green had Let's Stay Together, Take Me to the River, and he also had You Ought to Be With Me, Full of Fire, Let's Get Married. That was Al Green. He was Motown. Berry Gordy Jr. was part of the Motown. He included Marvin Gaye and all of them. So that's my lecture on the rock and roll pandemic that lasted from about the turn of the century, after the classical and romantic period, which was, like I said, all of them. Debussy, Claude Debussy, Claire de Lune, Chopin, Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, even American artists like George Gershwin, who you've seen me play on the piano, like Horatio Parker, American George Chadwick, Horatio Parker, you had Charles Ives, who all of them were students at Yale University for him, but they became lesser known composers. So, and they were before the era of Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky, the turn of the century, you know. So, yeah, and that's that. So, yeah, rock and roll. It was quite a large category. It was a huge, huge, huge genre. Country singers, Jason Aldean, Billy Ray Cyrus, Don't Break My Heart, My Achy Breaky Heart. That's part of rock and roll too. As well as George Strait, Garth Brooks, etc. So, yeah, that's rock and roll, but more. Shania Twain. You had it's so big. I mean, yeah, Elton John. And another thing I wanted to say about rock and roll too is you also had, it was a craze in the 50s. Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, and others like Jimmy Durante, who wrote Frosty the Snowman. That was part of rock and roll too. And so was Burl Ives from Rudolph. He sang all these songs like Silver and Gold, Have a Holly Jolly Christmas. A lot of these, speaking of which, a lot of artists have Christmas albums from rock and roll too. White Christmas, Bruce Springsteen's Santa Claus is Coming to Town, Mariah Carey, All I Want for Christmas Is You. All of this came from rock and roll. So, that's rock and roll.